The following episode contains discussions of drug use and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Keith has been out to some bars in Surfers Paradise and has found himself back at the house of two women he knows, Sally and Alison. With them is a young man named Shane, who has brought along his girlfriend. Keith thinks Shane must be about 17, but later on, he'll discover he's just 14. They're having a few drinks, and at about 10:30, he considers heading home. But Sally gets up and grabs something from another room. When she returns, she's carrying a tourniquet and foil. The rest of the room watches as she injects heroin, Alison eagerly awaiting her turn. When Sally finishes, she turns to Shane and says, "Want to try it?" Keith can't say anything, can't intervene. Everyone in the room thinks his name is Jim and believes he's a big-time drug dealer, simply watching people consume his product. But Keith isn't a drug dealer. He's an undercover cop. And what he sees in the next few minutes, sitting inside Sally and Alison's house, will stay with him for the rest of his life. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Keith Banks, one of Queensland's most highly regarded police officers, about his experiences as an undercover operative in the 1980s. At 16 years old, he travelled over 1,000 kilometres from Townsville to study at Brisbane's police academy in Oxley. And by the time he was 21, this young country boy was risking his life to infiltrate drug syndicates. To hide his identity, Keith often became involved in the exact crimes he was hired to uncover. In his new book, Drugs, Guns and Lies, My Life as an Undercover Cop, Keith shares his story as an undercover policeman in an era riddled with corruption. In the book, you say that the first 6 years of your life were happy. What happened after that?
My mother met and remarried a man who wasn't a very pleasant human being. I never met my natural father, or I didn't meet him until I tracked him down later in life. So the first memories I have are of growing up in a very small country town with grandparents, my mother, and three of my uncles. So it's just fantastic. It was in the bush, just great male role models, great family environment. When she remarried, we started moving around, and he drank way too much. He was physically abusive. He was mentally abusive, just not a very pleasant person at all.
How do you think he informed the rest of your life and the decisions that you'd make?
That's a great question. No one's asked me that yet. This is where I rolled out the whole self-analysis, I guess. I can remember being quite young, and as strange as it sounds, I think I may have been around 8 years old or so, when I made a firm decision I would never speak in the same manner. I would never be the same person as he was. I would treat people with respect, unlike him. I think his behaviours actually quite early informed me in such a way that I just chose to be completely different from my environment. I was very fortunate during my childhood and up until I was 16 when I left, that academically I was quite a high achiever. So I always knew that this would be a finite period in my life. I knew it wouldn't be like this forever. And the way for me to escape from that was to just classically pay attention at school and do as well as I could, because it would be a pathway out. I realised later in life that in my career I volunteered for what we call the sharp end. I wanted to be in every risky, adventurous, exciting thing there was to do. And as I say, I only realised probably in the last 10 or 15 years that I was subconsciously trying to prove myself to an abusive male figure in my life that I wasn't worthless or the useless kid that he told me pretty much every day I was.
Do you think as well that there was this desire for structure and almost authority because that in a way it hadn't existed because you didn't feel safe at home, and so you wanted this like police academy to offer you almost like a family unit that you'd craved? Was there an element of that?
Yeah, very big element. It was I decided I wanted to be a cop, but I also had a great affection for I think they're still around, an army cadet system. So I joined the army cadets in year 8, and I loved the structure, the discipline, but good discipline, and I really followed the attention of very good, positive male role models who were teachers who actually ran the academy. Oh, sorry, the army cadet system. And in a small country town where we eventually settled in near Townsville, there was a returned Vietnam veteran, fairly senior non-commissioned rank in the army, who was a very experienced, positive, worldly bloke, and I really, I loved all of that supportiveness, I suppose. That I wasn't getting in an unsafe environment in my house.
What did you imagine that being a police officer would look like?
Well, the only experience I'd had with police were those in country towns. Although we lived in Cairns for a couple of years, and unfortunately 2 police were called to our house by neighbours during quite a loud domestic dispute. And I may have been 11 or 12 then. And I remember these two men turned up, and they were actually quiet yet assertive authority figures who calmed everything down. And I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, they've made this house a bit safer for a while. And I thought, gee, I wonder what else they do and what other great things they can protect people from. And that was really where I started getting a bit of a sense of policing. But to be honest, look, I read as much as I could. As cliched as it sounds, I read the story of New York Police Detective Frank Serpico, whose whistleblowing after he was shot and almost killed in New York City. He was an undercover narcotic guy. There's probably a reason why I was attracted to it. He actually was the catalyst for not a royal commission, but a commission into police corruption in New York City. And I admired his integrity and his stance, and I absorbed as much as I could about him. But I really had no firm idea of what was in for me. So hence when I got to the academy, with hair down on my shoulders and this whole naive boy from the bush mentality, and I chuckle about it, that next 2 years was a real eye-opener. The discipline, in those days as a police cadet or a police recruit, if you committed some unpardonable sin like, I don't know, not having your sand shoes cleaned properly, or having not shaved close enough, or maybe some other unpardonable sin that you didn't really know was a sin, they would punish you by myriad of push-ups or getting an old rifle and forcing you to run around the oval in full winter uniform in a tunic and tie for an hour or so, or doing what we call fatigues, which is getting a toothbrush and literally cleaning stairs or tiles around the gymnasium for a couple of hours until you learnt your lesson.
Did you enjoy the police academy, or did you find it a real shock to the system?
I have to be honest, I actually enjoyed it. I enjoyed it apart from a bullying situation that I've written about in the book, and where I was bashed by a cadet after a couple of weeks of being there, who was a bit of and you have bullies everywhere, and this individual was just a bully. Apart from that, I actually thrived on it. I loved the fact that I had my own room. I'd never had my own bedroom. And I loved the fact that I was being paid. I had structure, and I actually quite enjoyed it, apart from the entire very, very short haircut situation. After all, it was the 70s.
What did you see in those early years of policing that you weren't necessarily expecting? Because you say in the book that the police academy it has its challenges, but nothing can really prepare you for what you see once you're actually in the force. What did you see that was surprising at first?
I think the fact that not all police were, in those days at least, as inspired or as motivated as I was to protect people from the bad guys. I'll just put it that simply. In those days, there were a lot of cops who drank on the job. Some of the larger stations, the City Police Station, the old Woolloongabba Police Station in Brisbane, a lot of those sergeants were, I'm trying to think of the polite word, not high performers. They were screw ups. There you go. That's without the expletives, and they were sent to these stations just to bide their time. So, they'd turn up. They'd either have an esky full of beer with them, or they had the little haunts to go to and drink on duty. And I have to say, I was pretty straight laced, and I still am horrified if I hear of uniformed police drinking on duty, of course, but in those days, I used to think, gee, this is obviously fairly common, and it never sat well with me because, again, to protect people from predators or others, you can't be drunk when you're at work. But that was part of the culture. The other was the level of violence that cops were being faced with back in those days. Whilst no one started shooting at us until probably the mid-1980s, it was almost a sport to try and get a copper either alone or with another one and get your mates and just see if you could bash the heck out of them as often as you could. So there was a certain level of violence that I wasn't really prepared for, but as a young cop, you become quickly used to it, I suppose, and it taught me a level of violence that I didn't think I had in myself either. Because when you're in the middle of a street fight, you are literally fighting for your well-being. I won't say life, but I've had friends who've had broken necks and broken backs, broken jaws, etc., by being kicked by a mob of thugs. And in those days, we didn't have tasers or capsicum spray or extendable batons or anything. It was really just, you had to learn to look after yourself pretty quickly.
I met the sergeant who was doing the job, and when I was introduced to him, he was full of booze. He was full, as well he might have been. I mean, the whole thing was a massive problem. Under Lewis, it was a massive issue.
To me, it felt that corruption wasn't just a moral issue. It was a practical one, and a pragmatic one as well. It was wrong for people to be corrupt, and that was what was essentially wrong with Queensland. I'd seen lots of reporters have a go at the Queensland corruption story and fail. So when a police officer from the Australian Bureau of Crime Intelligence in Canberra spoke to me about what he thought was a serious corruption issue in Queensland, I initially thought, oh no, not another Queensland crook story, they never work, people get burned, the witnesses get run out of town.
You went to do an arrest one night and had an interaction with an undercover cop. What appealed to you about that job in particular?
The unknown, I guess, the excitement of it, the unknown, the fact that it was specialised and completely different to what I'd experienced. I always wanted to, as I touched on before, I always wanted to do the stuff that was a bit outside the normal. I guess in hindsight, I wanted to be a super cop. I wanted to be the best one I could be. And what I saw of Undercover was an opportunity to really contribute to doing something about the drug trade. Sure, as a uniformed cop, you can make arrests, and I had arrested people for possession, etc. But that just appealed to me to really do something that was different. Plus, on a very young guy, 1970s level. If I was an undercover cop, I could dress how I wanted to and grow my hair and not be constrained by the whole uniform paramilitary thing.
Well, speaking of wearing what you want, what do you actually wear as an undercover policeman? How do you dress like the people that you are trying to fit in with?
Back in those days, the look was completely different from now. It was pretty much unheard of for police to have an earring for a start. So the first thing I did was go and get an earring. And I think the term undercover can be misconstrued by a lot of people. If you say undercover police, you'll hear people say, look, there are undercover police in the neighbourhood, and they mean police in plain clothes, or maybe wearing jeans and runners or something. So what I did was I just thought about the people that I'd interacted with on the street. I thought about the types of people that I'd seen. So basically, in the first instance, when I was doing street level work, I went literally to an army disposal store and got a big green old army jacket and some flannelette shirts and a t-shirt and old jeans, etc., and just really dressed right down. But as I progressed through not so much street level stuff, that was more of an apprenticeship, into setting up major heroin deals, I actually dressed always a little bit better than the norm, because obviously my backstory was that I was a pretty successful dealer with a large network of distribution, so I would have been making a lot of money. So it was really a matter of probably developing the ability to be a chameleon, I reckon. But on my first day, as I have a very developed weird sense of humour, so I think in the chapter on that book, my first day I was faced with a problem I hadn't anticipated. I didn't know what to wear. And I look back and think, gee whiz, I was incredibly naive about the whole scene then.
No training, no supervision, no backup. That's what it meant to be an undercover cop in 1980s Queensland.
You need to think like the enemy. You need to talk like them, act like them, and in fact be them without being them.
You didn't even drink before you started as an undercover cop. Did you have to start?
Yeah, I didn't drink at all. I was a martial artist and I was training 5 days a week, and I was the boring guy that would go to a party and drink orange juice and then, not do anything untoward at all until literally I think the third or fourth day of my undercover career, where I met someone in a pub and and he said, he turned to the barman and said, "Well, I have 2 beers," and I said, "I don't drink, mate." And he looked at me and said, "Well, you do now." And and that was the beginning of the end, really.
And you were spending time with these criminals, these people that were engaged in criminal activity. Were you scared at first that you'd be caught? Because from the sounds of it, those people are very sceptical from the beginning and are almost interrogating you because they are worried you might be a cop. Was that scary?
Yeah, it was. But it was more because I wanted to be so good at it. I was more afraid that they'd actually not fall for it, if that makes sense. So, because, at the age of 21 and 22, as a young man, the world's an adventure, and this thing was an incredible adventure, and the fear and the adrenaline are very addictive. So I just wanted to be the best one I could be, and it really annoyed me when people were a bit suspicious of me in the first place, because I had no idea what I was doing. We had no training course. I was given some tips by an older guy, Pete, and then Pete sort of went away on a well-deserved leave break, and he finished undercover reasonably soon after that. So there were situations, though, that could have rendered really badly for me, because unlike television, we didn't have any surveillance watching us, and we didn't have anybody who could back us up. We were literally deep cover, different identity, and all by ourselves. So it just really, the more experienced I got, the more able I was to talk my way out of situations and so on. But yeah, certainly those first few months were a bit hairy.
There's a story in the book about a conversation you had with a man named Ivan who accused you in a pub, I think it was, of being an undercover cop. What happened with him?
Well, I'd been that was my first undercover job, and he'd been suspicious of me from the first day because I just didn't know what I was doing. I then went away to North Queensland for I think a couple of months, and you could probably say did my apprenticeship. So I became more confident and able when I came back. So I re-established contact with him. And in those days, we didn't have any proper backstory identity cover. We simply used old number plates that came from a cardboard box in the drug squad. And so I had false plates on my car. And I went to meet him on a Friday night in a particular pub that was a mecca for drug dealers and bad people. And I remember I walked in there and the place was packed in the beer garden. And the only two reasons you went to this pub were to either deal or to score. So there were a bunch of patched motorcycle gang members in one corner and just, a bunch of thugs all around the place. And I sat down with him and in a nutshell, he just looked at me and said, I think you're a narc. And suddenly I realised I was all alone in a big crowd of people. So the only thing I could do was stand up and scream at him and accuse him of being a dog, which in underworld terms is an informer. And that sort of put him on the back foot. And I just yelled at him and said, how can you check my effing number plates, you dog, blah, blah, blah. He'd actually had a friend in the Queensland Main Roads Department that he'd paid some money to run a check on the registration number. So when he said that, I just simply said, well, I wouldn't be stupid enough to use false plates when I'm buying from you. I don't trust you as far as I can throw you, that sort of thing. And pushed my way out. And I remember I got to my car and I was trying to put the key in the in the door lock. My hands were shaking so badly with fear and adrenaline, it took me a few seconds to actually open the door and leave and drive off. But when I woke up the next morning, I thought to myself, whew, that was a rush. And that was the problem. It was so exhilarating to be in a situation like that and then be able to walk away from it that it just became an addictive thing to do.
Tell me what it was like later facing him. So he'd obviously accused you of being a policeman and you'd somewhat convinced him otherwise. But then you got to see him after he'd been arrested. What did you feel? I know this is a strange question, but is there some guilt?
No, not with him. Not at all. He was a violent standover thug, really. So back in those days, again, I can't comment on what happens nowadays, and it's really none of my business because I've been a civilian for a long time. But back in those days, after every undercover operation was concluded, the targets or the dealers were told who we were. So they'd be charged with a number of counts of supplying drugs to an undercover agent, and they'd actually tell them what our real name was and walk us into the interview room and say, and this is the person who sold the drugs to, which is quite an amateurish way to do things. But so when I walked into the interview room and saw him, I had an immense sense of satisfaction because he'd actually tried to stand over me and threaten me with violence a number of times. So yeah, I felt pretty damn good about it, to be honest.
Were there other instances with people who maybe you were more able to see their humanity, where there was a sense of betrayal, where you could sort of see the shades of grey and that didn't feel so good?
Yeah, that's the problem with staying in that field for a while. And I've spoken to a lot of other ex-undercovers, who came a few years after me as well. And the common thread is that a lot of us had that. It was a challenge for us to betray people that we befriended. So you literally went into a scene or an operation befriending people with the absolute intention of betraying them at some point. And some of those people I actually quite liked, as strange as that sounds. Even though they were drug dealers, they were engaging, funny, entertaining, affable, all of those things. And sometimes I'd actually quite look forward to spending time with them. But you always had to retain the memory that in the back of your mind that you were the good guy and they weren't the good guy. But it didn't stop you from actually enjoying their company. So it was pretty challenging.
You tell a story in the book about a woman named Sally who you grew to quite like for a while. And I wondered what it was like watching someone like that who you came to almost care about use drugs. I believe she was using heroin, which is enormously destructive. Were there points where you almost wanted to intervene and help these people?
Yeah. She was an interesting person. She was bubbly. She was beautiful. She was fun. But I saw her, I guess, her real personality come out a couple of months into the time of knowing her. And I saw her inject a very young boy with heroin one night, who I felt a real affinity with because his father belted him a fair bit, quite violently. Not just the normal corporal punishment of those days, but yeah, he used to belt him quite badly. So I had an affinity with him as a result of my background, and I tried to give him a little bit of almost big brother guidance without giving away my cover, because my cover was I was a heroin dealer. And I saw her inject him with heroin one night in a house, and I realised later, I thought he was about 17 or 18, but I realised later he was only a 14-year-old kid. And I've never forgotten that scene because I couldn't do anything to stop it. If I had intervened, it would have ruined the entire operation, and I just didn't know. I honestly didn't know what to do. And all I could think of was you've just got to just let it go. And I've always struggled with that because I kept track of him years later, and he died of a heroin overdose when he was about 18, which was heartbreaking. So I saw what I thought on the surface was this wonderful, nice, funny woman, and she would have been, I think she was in her early 20s then, maybe mid-20s. She was a couple of years older than I was. But then I saw that side of her come out, and it horrified me.
Were there times during your time as an undercover cop where you had to use the drugs in order to convince people that you were who you said you were?
Yeah, look, I've written very openly about the fact that we all smoked dope. Pretty hard to set up a 5 or 10 pound drug deal when you don't smoke dope, because dope is not in the same category in my view as heroin or cocaine, speed, acid, whatever. And I rationalise that with myself. As I've said, I was a teetotaler. I just rationalised that, okay, if I've got to smoke this to do what I've got to do to achieve something, then so be it. But there was one night fairly early in my undercover time where, and again I have to reinforce, we didn't have any backup or surveillance. I set up a drug deal to buy a couple of grams of speed, so amphetamines, and I went to a place in Auchenflower, which in those days, Auchenflower is now beautiful. It was pretty grotty, and it was full of squats and, pretty ordinary little flats and so on. And so I knocked on the door at the prearranged time, and or a little bit later than the prearranged time. You never turned up in time; that would have been too suspicious. And the door opened, and the guy that I was due to meet was speeding right off his head. And so I walked inside, gave him the money, got the gear, and was about to go when he insisted that we have a line. And I said, "Don't use it, mate. I'm in it for the money." And at which point he produced a small or a sawn-off double-barrel shotgun and told me in no uncertain terms that I was either having a line with him or he was going to shoot me. So that's when you make a split-second decision, and my decision was, okay, where's the straw? And away we go. I still, from that day to this, don't know whether it was loaded, but I certainly wasn't going to take a chance to find out. I'd had a shotgun put in my face when I was a very junior uniform policeman, and not that long before. So I thought this time discretion was a better part of valour. So that was the first and only time I ever used amphetamines, and it wasn't so much to convince him that I wasn't undercover. It was actually, I thought I was going to die if I didn't.
And was it difficult when you're really ingratiated in this underworld to have friends and relationships outside of that?
Yeah, it was impossible to have a relationship. It would have meant that anyone I was with I would have been lying to. I had told a number of people I did martial arts with that I'd left the police force, that I was somewhat in disgrace, and it was just a matter of staying away from anybody who knew me as best I could. Although I was certainly recognised a couple of times by people I'd gone to school with, and when you're recognised and called by your right name when you're actually using another name, it's a bit of a tricky situation to get out of.
Why did you eventually decide to leave?
Undercover. Yeah, a couple of things. I was probably enjoying the lifestyle too much. In other words, I thought it would be difficult to make a transition back, or as we call it, to resurface. And I just realised, that what I was doing and what we were doing wasn't making an iota of difference to the drug trade. It was more about statistics and figures, and it wasn't helping my career at all. Undercovers probably weren't as appreciated as I thought they should have been, and we were really just, in some cases, used by investigating detectives quite cynically to boost their arrest rate for their next promotion or transfer. And I just thought, yeah, it's time I went back. No other reason, it was just I always thought I'd be in the police force for life. So I was already planning to become a detective and really get back on that career path, I guess.
So did you feel when you did transition back that you'd done anything meaningful? Because you had arrests and some bad people had been locked away. Did you have a sense that you'd succeeded in that, or did it feel as though you were barely even scratching the surface?
Yeah. Another great question. I was proud of what I did. I was proud of the fact that, some people had been sent to jail. I was proud of the fact that some drug dealers had been taken off the streets. By the same token, I just thought it was, you're right, not scratching the surface. And I also witnessed a couple of corrupt activities by people that just basically devastated me, that police were, some police, the vast majority of police I worked with were honest and wonderful people, but there were a handful that weren't. And that really gave me, I think, a cynical view of the world that was almost like the drugs that we were taking off the street, this handful of corrupt people were putting back on again. And I just thought it was high time I moved away from that at the ripe old age of 23.
You were in the courtroom when Sally was eventually questioned. Tell me what happened in that room and how it actually affected a real life relationship of yours, which was with a woman named Linda.
Yeah, that was, she had pleaded guilty to a number of supply charges. I think there might have even been a trafficking charge in there because of the amount of heroin that I'd bought from her over the period of the operation. And because she'd pleaded guilty, and I think from memory it was a district court, so it was the step above a normal magistrate's court, I didn't have to give evidence. So I was there for the sentencing, and the judge asked her if she had any commentary to make, and at that point she stood up and claimed that I'd had a sexual relationship with her and that she'd fallen in love with me and she'd only done it to please me and so on. And what infuriated me was that I had no right of reply because it was all rubbish, it was all crap. And I had been seeing a young woman who was working in the prosecutor's office, and she was in the court when this statement was made, and that was it. That was over. So I never really had an opportunity to defend myself, either way. And that's that's pretty tough for a 23 or 24-year-old kid when you just feel like there's such an unfair balance in the world, I suppose. And all of these things just build up and create a cynical approach to a lot of things in the world. And as sad as it sounds, at that age I was starting to become quite hardened and jaded as a result of things like that.
And that woman who was in the courtroom, she didn't believe you when you said it wasn't true. So that must have been infuriating because, as you say, Sally was quite an attractive woman who was standing there claiming this thing happened. And so Linda's just assuming that, of course, it did.
That's right. That's exactly right. And even the male prosecutor sort of, as he walked past, he winked at me and said something like, "Well, she's a good sort, mate, so I get it." So, it was found guilty without appeal, if I can use that analogy. So then, I guess I just moved on with my life.
And what did you learn from that time? We touched on it before, but about the types of people who commit these sorts of crimes, because you did spend an enormous amount of time with these people and talking to them and realising that they're human beings. And often I would imagine that, socioeconomic status or their upbringing has influenced decisions they're making today. Did it change the way you saw these criminals, and did it almost make you question good and bad and what that even means?
Yeah, I'd been brought up from the first day of policing to believe that there was black and white. That was it. There was a criminal code in place, as in a legislative criminal code, Crimes Act, and other areas. There were all these legislation and regulations, and if you broke the law, you broke the law. That was it. After a couple of years working in the undercover area, and I look back and I think, thank God I did, because it actually taught me that there is no black and white. There are just shades of sepia or grey. People are people. They make mistakes. They do things. I don't excuse any criminal activity. But I met people in that scene that were faithful to their partners, that were family people, that loved their kids, And I remember looking at it thinking, gee, I know some coppers who don't have those traits. It just gave me more of a balanced outlook on life. And I honestly think that, 19 is way too young to be sworn into a policing environment. I'd think in hindsight I probably should have waited till I was around that 21 or 22, maybe a bit older with some more worldly experience. But I got that through Undercover. So when I came back into normal policing and later became a detective and did various other things, it gave me an ability to have empathy when I was dealing with offenders. And speaking to some pretty experienced detectives, I think, we all agree that empathy is the best trait to have as an investigator. It doesn't mean that you forgive the offender, but you can certainly empathise with what's triggered them, caused them. Some people are just bad, and you can even use empathy with them. So it was an interesting journey. And there were a couple of people I actually felt very sorry for when they were arrested. And even, through my detective career later, I could look at offenders and actually feel some genuine sympathy for them, whereas I probably wouldn't have been when I was much younger.
Yeah, I can imagine that colours the rest of your career and the way that you would interact with people as sort of maybe not having as much of an us versus them mentality, because you let yourself get very close to these people, which I imagine a lot of police have never done before. So it's a very interesting tale in that way of how it might have changed your policing journey.
Yeah, and I think every undercover is the same. And that's why it was difficult in those days for the general police community to really probably understand undercover people, and there's probably, I don't know about modern times, but I'm pretty sure there's still a bit of that. I actually I spoke with a Victorian policeman in a social situation about 3 or 4 months ago. We were talking about this, and he said that there were 2 undercover operatives that were brought out of whatever they were doing, and the rest of the police got together to have a barbecue and, assimilate them back in. And these 2 people spent the entire day just by themselves away from the whole group. And I said, that's exactly what it's going to be for quite some time, because undercover police live a different life and general police don't really understand them. Like general police live a different life and normal people don't really understand them. So, it's that specialist thing within a culture of an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
That was fairly deep, wasn't it?
Thank you so much for your time. That's an incredible story, and I encourage everyone to buy the book because it's fascinating.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Keith Banks's book is called Drugs, Guns and Lies: My Life as an Undercover Cop. It has been released this month and is available to purchase online at all good bookstores and via the link in the description of this episode. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our executive producer is Elise Cooper, with additional production by Hannah Bowman. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.